walking on the city train to spend some time on the road.
After making videos on both Life is Strange and Before the Storm, I figured I may as well round it off with a video about Life is Strange 2. The first time I played through it, I didn't have much to say, but after completing it a second time, my perspective on it changed a little, so I'd like to share my thoughts on the game, what I think it got right, and where I felt it was lacking. For those who haven't played the game before, our protagonist is Sean Diaz, a 17-year-old Mexican-American who lives with his younger brother Daniel and his father Esteban in Seattle. Sean is living a typical teenage life until his father is shot by the police during an altercation, and he flees the scene along with his brother Daniel. The two soon come to realize that Daniel has telekinetic powers, and we follow their journey on the run from the authorities. Just like the previous games in the series, Life is Strange 2 tackles a variety of social and personal issues through its gameplay and characters. I've broken down this video into individual chapters to cover what I want to talk about, so feel free to skip around, there are timestamps in the description.
Okay. I think it's time for us to hit the road.
At its core, Life is Strange 2 is about the brotherhood between Sean and Daniel. The game separates itself from its predecessor in that you are now responsible not only for your actions, but also for those of your little brother. A lot of what you do in the game shapes Daniel's decision making as he observes your behaviour, regardless of whether you want him to or not. On the surface, it sounds like the standard fare for a narrative-based game, but it really takes the next big step as it follows in the footsteps of previous iterations like Clementine from The Walking Dead. To get technical, Daniel operates on a double-layered system of morality and brotherhood. Choices you make may raise his brotherhood, causing him to like you more, but will also lower his morality, which can lead to him partaking in bad behaviour. These systems are affected by small choices just as much as they are by big ones, so you need to always be aware of how Daniel will perceive your decisions. A stolen chocolate bar early on is innocent enough, but it could lead to more serious consequences down the line. This is particularly important because Daniel is the one with the superpowers, so a large chunk of your relationship with him is ensuring that he uses that power responsibly. Daniel's superpower is handled pretty well. In the Life is Strange games, I really enjoy that the supernatural elements are used solely as a vehicle for the narrative, rather than the narrative becoming about the supernatural elements. We don't need to know how Daniel got his powers or why, because the story isn't about that, it's about his relationship with Sean. You could completely remove the powers from the story and everything would effectively remain the same. It just adds that little bit of intrigue that you wouldn't get from something in real life. AI companions are often frustrating in games, but the team at Donut have done a great job with Daniel, as he keeps out of your way but also interacts with you and his environment to feel more like a real kid and not just like an NPC. If you're in a forest, he'll explore the surroundings and point out things you might not have even noticed. It isn't unprecedented in video games for there to be a competent AI companion, but particularly for narrative-based games, this feels like an ample push forwards into the next level of what's possible. Overall, the connection between the two brothers feels pretty authentic. They butt heads a lot in arguments, so there's no shortage of conflict, but you know obviously that they care for one another. I will say that I didn't care for Daniel as much as the game wanted me to. The brother dynamic is in a weird spot where they're not equals due to their age difference, but also I feel less responsible for him than I would with a character like Clementine, because thanks to his power, Daniel is a lot more capable and independent. I want him to do the right thing, but beyond that, I know he's powerful enough to take care of himself, so I never really had this primal instinct to protect him or a parental desire to keep him safe and secure. Daniel also tends to fall into the I'm not a little kid anymore trope where he thinks he's mature, and that can get frustrating at times when he claims he's responsible and then immediately makes a poor decision.
Now explain.
That sneaky fucker? He was snooping around your living room.
No, I wasn't! I was just bored, so I came in.
Shut up, Daniel!
I think Donut made a great technical leap with Daniel, but when it comes to storytelling, for me it was one of the less interesting relationships, which is kind of concerning when it's meant to be the core of the narrative.
We're freaking fighters.
Yeah, you're right. Best freaking fighters forever.
The first third of episode 1 begins very much like you would expect a Life is Strange sequel to begin. Sean has just come home from school with his best friend Lyla, and is getting ready for a party happening later that night. The two sit on the steps outside Sean's house and have a casual conversation between one another. Donut creates a comfy and familiar atmosphere here that's reminiscent of the first game, and that's very much by design.
That's what we wanted to have in this first episode. The first half of the episode 1 is really this setting that looks a lot like the first Life is Strange, where you're just a teenager being happy with your family, with your friends, going to a party. This kind of feeling that for Sean is his life. For the player, for us, it would be something that the player would love because it reminds him of home, of the previous game. And then that when the incident happens and is forced to leave that behind, as well as the player is forced to just be on the road and leave the comfort of this cocoon of friends and party and everything.
Being abruptly thrust into this life on the road comes out of nowhere after establishing this initial set of characters that we assumed were going to be our main cast. From here on out, Daniel's life is never the same again, and there is a distinct before and after that is set in place, causing his time in Seattle to become nothing more than a nostalgic memory. Being his best friend, Lyla essentially serves as the symbol for Sean's past life, representing everything that he was forced to leave behind. Often when Sean is reflecting on something from his time in Seattle, Lyla is somehow interwoven with it.
So, tell me, what do you miss about your old life?
Well, apart from my dad, I'd say Lyla. Definitely. She was like my best friend. I miss our talks.
I'm sure she's very special.
Even when I had a shitty day, she would always make me laugh. Always. Feels like years since we talked. Probably never again.
The game follows through with this as there is no return to normal for Sean. In fact, he never sees Lyla again, with the exception of a brief cameo in one of the determinant endings. The closest we come to a reunion with Lyla are 2 optional phone calls, which both are some of the most heart-wrenching scenes in the game for me, especially the latter of the 2, as the voice actors really give it their all.
I don't want you to get into any more trouble because of me. I better go.
No! Please, don't. Do not hang up on me. Not this time, dude. Talk to me. Please.
These scenes make it more than clear just how much the 2 mean to each other, and really exposes just how painful it is for Sean that he can never go back to his old life. It was critical for Don't Nod to make Lyla an extremely likable character in the short screen time she receives at the beginning, and it's incredibly cruel to make her time so short, but at the end of the day, that's why I enjoy her so much as a character. You really cherish every moment you get with her because you know how sparse those moments will be. Lyla is certainly a highlight of how capable Don't Nod has become at playing with your emotions and creating this incredibly strong bond that is just so evident in every exchange between the 2.
If a house is divided against itself, that house cannot stand.
Turning now to a more villainous character, Lisbeth is the main antagonist in episode 4 of the series. Daniel has been missing for several months, and Sean is finally able to track him down to a local church in Haven Point. However, their pastor, Lisbeth, has brought Daniel into her fold and refuses to give him up to Sean. Lisbeth has manipulated Daniel into believing that his place is with the church, and it becomes Sean's task to get Daniel back. On a surface level, Lisbeth's character may be perceived as a criticism of religion, but I think it's a little more specific in that it delves into cults and the manipulative behaviour that tears families and friends apart. Religion is never really portrayed in a negative light in Life is Strange 2, as the churchgoers are all content with their beliefs, and the other pastors from neighbouring churches even voice their disapproval of Lisbeth's approach to her faith. I'm quite glad Don't Nod took this more nuanced approach because religion is already heavily criticised a lot in the media. They instead take aim at the manipulation that Lisbeth employs to keep Daniel by her side. When you're given the opportunity to explore her house, it gives a great insight into how insidious her behaviour really is. Daniel's colourless room is decorated with little but unsettling drawings and homework that Lisbeth uses to condition him. His behaviour and living space become so far removed from who he once was that your hatred for Lisbeth and what she's done to Daniel really grows. One document you find even reveals her plans to adopt Daniel, separating him from his family even in name.
Take a look.
What? Is she trying to adopt Daniel?
Exactly. And she's doing it under the table, of course.
Her deceit isn't limited to Daniel, however. Jacob is one of the characters we meet in episode 3, and in episode 4, it's revealed to us that he was forced to leave his church due to his homosexuality, after Lisbeth had attempted to use conversion therapy to appease his parents. Not only that, but his sister Sarah Lee is suffering from pneumonia, and instead of receiving medical treatment, her parents have turned to Lisbeth to use her faith to heal Sarah Lee. I think these two serve as very realistic examples of how religion is used as a tool to manipulate others, and it certainly cements Lisbeth's character to be incredibly disingenuous. What was most effective for me was talking to Sarah Lee about her condition. Seeing a child too young to understand her illness being led on by Lisbeth for the sole intent of extracting money from Sarah Lee's parents really made my blood boil. Episode 4 comes to a conclusion with Daniel breaking free of Lisbeth's grasp and coming back to Sean. This sequence isn't too incredible because you assume that Daniel will come back to you regardless of what you say, given that there is still one episode left in the series, but it's a nice little climactic moment nonetheless. The choice of music is also really good. The choir obviously fits in with all the religious stuff going on, and the imagery of the burning church is really powerful. Overall, Lisbeth makes for a great villain, and especially considering she's only in one episode, they did a great job of pacing it all out, where everything is covered but nothing feels rushed. Pretty much every scene conveys what it needs to in an adequate amount of time. I rarely have a favourite episode when I play narrative-based games, but episode 4 here really takes the cake, partially due to Lisbeth and partially due to what I'm about to talk about next.
Sean, whatever you want to say to me, this is the time. Let's just get it all out in the open. See what happens.
Now we come to what I personally think is the greatest part of Life is Strange 2, which is Karen. In the beginning of the game, we know that Sean and Daniel's mother, Karen, is missing from their life, and we're drip-fed info about her every now and then, ranging from Sean's intense hatred of her to the revelation that she is in fact alive, and left the Diaz family shortly after Daniel was born. Even in their dire situation of being on the road with nowhere to go, Sean still refuses to even consider turning to Karen, which is very telling of just how much he despises her. What makes this even more intriguing is that unlike Sean, Daniel is very interested in meeting his mother, as he was only an infant when she left. In episode 2, we also come across a letter from Karen, who is actively trying to find Sean and Daniel, so there's a lot going on here between the opposing outlooks of the two brothers and the intrigue behind Karen's actions and motivations. It's such an incredible moment in episode 4 after Sean has just lost Daniel to Lisbeth, and he turns around to all of a sudden see Karen for the first time in over 8 years, right by his side.
Daniel, hey! Daniel?
Sean?
Karen?
You won't get him back like this. Let's go.
When we were already so focused on this narrative of Lisbeth keeping Daniel under her wing, out of nowhere we suddenly reconnect with Sean's mother. From here the narrative takes a complete detour to explore the relationship between Sean and Karen, and it leads to some of the most earnest and captivating dialogue in the entire game. Karen explains not only why she left, but also how she's made peace with her decision. It's so rare to see in the media when a character makes a decision as big as leaving their family behind, but sincerely doesn't regret it, because her confidence in her actions means it's now entirely up to Sean on if he wants to forgive her or not. The entire dynamic of the relationship is just executed so well. It feels incredibly real, and it doesn't come off as melodramatic or sensationalized. The time they spent together at the motel was incredibly emotional for me, particularly during the simple action of Karen replacing Sean's bandage for him. It's this brief and silent moment where you can see how desperately Sean wishes he had this motherly care during his childhood. It's a very bittersweet moment that's both heartwarming and heartbreaking. The voice actor did a great job portraying Karen, Despite not wanting to be a mother, her voice is so relaxed and soothing, which also feels consistent with her attitude of someone who has accepted their past decisions.
That's when you know someone is good to you. When you can just sit together, shut the hell up, and watch the universe do its own thing.
It's built up so well throughout the series, and it pays off in such a satisfying way that it honestly overshadows the brotherhood between Sean and Daniel in terms of the impact that it had on me. When I think of the reasons why I enjoy this game so much, Karen is pretty much on the top of the list. Having the opportunity to make peace with, or at least better understand his mother, is a really touching thing for Sean, and I'm super glad that Don't Nod came up with this concept.
You and your unborn parasite have nothing in common with me and my family.
A big part of the game is Sean's nationality as a Mexican American, and the different types of people he comes across on his journey with Daniel. Something really interesting about Life is Strange 2 to me is that with the exception of Lisbeth, there are no authoritative figures that are really portrayed as villains. The cop in episode 1 is clearly nervous and doesn't have explicit intent to shoot Esteban. The FBI agent that Sean meets, called Agent Flores, is simply trying to locate Daniel and harbors no ill will against Sean. And the cop in episode 5 that interrogates Sean treats him fairly humanely without being condescending. The antagonists of the story are really just everyday people and the prejudices they hold against Sean for his nationality. Sean's neighbour, the shop owner's husband, the landowners in the country, and the vigilantes all cause Sean trouble due to his race. By Don't Nod going about it in this manner, personally it felt like they were putting the focus on the attitude rather than the person. This is a critical differentiation because it in turn gets the player to think about the attitude rather than the person. It's a lot more substantive for the player to form an opinion about prejudicial behaviour rather than an opinion about the vigilantes, for example, because it gets them to see the wider issue and its relevance in real life. With such a sensitive topic, you really need to be careful with how you portray the racism. If it's downplayed, then it feels like you're trying to brush a very real issue under the rug. But if you over-exaggerate it, then it starts to feel very dishonest. I think in most cases it's handled pretty well. I noticed that there's often a secondary person to the antagonist who doesn't have the same hostility against Sean, but also doesn't speak up to prevent the aggression. I really appreciated that because I feel like that's a very real thing that happens a lot in everyday life. Just to name some examples, a highlight scene for me was when Sean encounters the landowners at night, because it was honestly a pretty scary moment.
So, one more lesson. How do you say, "This is not my country"?
That line in particular hit really hard, and overall it felt quite threatening and tense. Not every scene is perfect. The major exception that comes to mind for me is the scene with Brody and Sean when they're at the Oregon coast. Sean getting worked up in the space of 15 seconds combined with a lot of Brody's fairly cliche dialogue ended up making the scene a little inauthentic. I think Don't Nod did a great job with not just portraying racism, but substantively using the portrayal to get the player to think about these issues in real life, which is pretty much the best you can ask for.
So, here we are, Daniel. The end of the road.
Finally. Let's get out of here.
I've talked about most of what I enjoyed from Life is Strange 2, but now I want to delve into my main criticism of the game, which is the narrative structure, specifically the road trip style that they went for. Due to Sean and Daniel being on the road, they never stay in one place for too long, which means we're introduced to a lot of characters that we never see again. For the most part, each episode has its own set of characters and subplot. While there is of course the ongoing narrative connecting each episode, this means that every episode is fairly standalone. Their reason for choosing this method of storytelling was so they could take a different approach from the first Life is Strange.
From the beginning, it's something that we wanted to somehow to change the formula, to also to surprise the players, to bring something new, to just not do again the small town setting where everybody knows everybody and everything took place in the same environment. We love this setting, and it's a really great setting. It's a cool to work with, but it was important for us to try something new, to also to renew the interest and have a different pacing and different situations. So that's why we decided to go with this road movie structure, where you would just be on the run and go on this journey and meet characters in a place, learn from them, teach them something, maybe change somehow their life, and quickly leave them behind and find new people, and you are missing the people you found before, but you have to go on and advance.
It's a really bold move to take, and I sincerely applaud them for being so willing to take risks in their storytelling. But I think ultimately the road trip narrative limits their ability to create impactful relationships and connections with other characters. By limiting the screen time the characters get, it means that we have less time to become attached to them. This is an issue that plagues the game because there are so few characters that get sufficient screen time to become meaningful to us. The dog Mushroom, for example, is with the brothers for about only half an episode, so without any major scenes for us to grow closer to her, we ultimately aren't as attached as we could be when she dies. Lyla and Karen are two of the strongest characters because they're both introduced in episode 1 when we're placing our emotional betting chips, and they are revisited several times throughout the game to reinforce our investment in them. We have the opportunity to call Lyla twice, and Karen's relationship with Sean in episode 4 gets a huge amount of screen time to flourish. I think the most egregious examples are episode 3 and 5. By episode 3, we've come to learn that we're probably never going to see most of these characters again once the episode is over, so it's almost like the game is conditioning us to not get attached to anyone new that we meet. The crew at the pop farm have an interesting dynamic, but we start to see them from more a tourist point of view than actually connecting with them. Episode 5 is even worse because the narrative has almost wrapped up and we're still being introduced to new characters. We had finished placing our emotional betting chips a long time ago, so by this point we just don't care about these new characters. On my first playthrough, I didn't even talk to half of them because of how disinteresting they were to me. I do commend Dontnod for trying something different, but they ultimately just shot themselves in the foot here. Most of the cast feels less like characters and more like tourist attractions. We're here to stop by and get a quick look before we move on to the next pit stop. It's a shame really because there is certainly potential to be had with the characters, it's just not as fulfilling as it could have been had we been given more time to bond and form relationships with them.
I'm grateful for what I have, yeah. Not everything is perfect, but we got balance, prospects. That's way more than I had before.
Before we wrap up, I'd just like to talk about a couple of smaller details about the game briefly. Amongst the crew in episode 3, Hannah was a standout character to me. She's very hostile to the outsiders, so it's really rewarding when you're able to get a little closer with her and learn a bit about her. Considering that she has a fairly resilient and sometimes unapproachable aura, it's cool that Dontnod managed to still make her a likable character. Agent Flores had some potential but was fairly underutilized. She's the most intimate that Sean gets with the authorities, so I feel like there was a lot of potential for interesting conversation to be had there, but nothing of substance really comes out of it. Her voice acting was pretty great at the end of episode 5. You get the feeling that she really does value the safety of Sean and Daniel and just wants to minimize the amount of suffering by doing her job.
I don't want to be separated.
Hear me out! Please! Don't make any more mistakes!
Whatever happens,
Too late to surrender!
always remember that you're Daniel Diaz.
You know this is
I promise, Sean.
a trap. You can trust me. Please, get out of the car. Come on. There's no way out.
Chloe's stepfather David from the first Life is Strange game makes an appearance in episode 5, which is a little bizarre to say the least. Dontnod put him in there essentially as a nod to the first game, while giving closure to it and helping the player move on from Max and Chloe's story.
We also didn't want to be too fan service stuff, you know? We don't want to bring back Max and Chloe only to please fan, but we wanted also to give some news about them, because we really loved Max and Chloe, and even for us it was hard to leave them behind when we created Life is Strange 2. But we also we wanted from the beginning to create stuff and you know, for example, in the first episode, as you mentioned, the fact that you can have Arcadia Bay destroyed or fine. What we wanted to show in this scene is to also tell the player in a metaphoric or symbolic way, this is the past. Even if we love this town, this is the past. Now look, this is Daniel, this is your future. It was a metaphor to say, even if you loved the first Life is Strange, and we deeply loved our first game, we need to move on and try something else.
It does feel very strange, as it's kind of fan service, but in such a microdose. David only briefly talks about Chloe for a few lines. It was certainly odd to include him in the game, but he's in and out so quickly that it didn't really faze me. Lastly, Sean's grandparents in episode 2 were great additions to the cast. It made things interesting considering Karen is their daughter, so their relationship with Sean and Daniel is a little strange due to that. Claire is very protective of the brothers, and her conversation with Sean at the end of episode 2 when they get separated was pretty moving.
I'm so sorry for everything. I wish we could have helped you more. I wish you could stay here with us. Watch out for your brother, Sean.
Yes. Be careful. We'll see you as soon as we can, okay?
Thanks for helping us. Both of you.
Oh, we love you. Now hurry up.
Life is Strange 2 had a lot to live up to, and while it didn't hit every target, I think it's a more than worthy entry in the series. To be honest, the biggest highs of Life is Strange 2 eclipse anything from the first game. Characters like Lyla, Karen, and Lisbeth really showed off how much Don't has learned about getting the most out of a character. With Karen and Lisbeth in particular, pretty much every avenue you want to be explored with them is covered. Their stories have a satisfying amount of weight behind them and reach an appropriate conclusion. While it's a shame that the road trip style limits how much we get to see of most of the characters, I still value the fact that Don't was willing to take that risk. We very easily could have gotten a more predictable and forced sequel with Max and Chloe, with Don't cashing in on fan service, but they proved themselves to be above that by crafting something entirely original that still follows the same spirit as the first game. Sean and Daniel might not be as important to me as Max and Chloe were, but the people that they meet have carved out a space in my mind that made me see things differently about the world, which is all I could possibly ask for in a narrative-based game. It goes without saying that I wholeheartedly recommend Life is Strange 2. It's a fantastic entry into the series, and I'm more than excited to see what else Don't has to offer with future titles.
Okay, it's getting way late and I gotta pick out my outfit for tonight. Skype me later when you're ready. Hugs. Talk to you soon.
Hello, Friday night.